discussions with other women who are in technical fields, who are, I don't want to use the word older, but who are 40 plus, that have been through the gauntlet pre a lot of progress that we've had more recently. I was sharing with a friend of mine who's currently going through a sexual harassment, it's not a suit yet, but anyway, situation at her work, and she's in construction as well. And she and I were discussing like what our file says. And I said, well, my file doesn't say anything because for years and years, I was conflating, though I didn't know any better, the words sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I was like, well, no one's smacking my ass on the job site. I'm fine. I've never been sexually harassed. So I very much enjoy talking to people who are more seasoned in the industry and have some more stories to tell about how things really are. Both kind of, it's cathartic to share, like I've been there too, girl, but also to show we think we've come far, but we have so much further to go. And however I can be a support of people who are coming up in the industry now, who are, trying to make life choices and decisions and not pull their hair out, if I can make their lives any easier along the way, I'm here for it.
Thank you for sharing that. I was talking about sexual harassment in construction with one of my teammates earlier today, and everybody says tech is hard. Like you have no idea what it's like on a construction site. Mm-hmm. It is a different being. But I want to dig into the topic. But before we get there, tell us a bit about how did you end up in engineering, like college, and then,
So I really wanted, and I hate to even say this out loud because engineers and architects, but I wanted to be an architect because I didn't know what an engineer was. And so I was taking a lot of studio classes. I was doing a lot of things that, they, in the in the 90s, like they had pretty good tracks of do these things in high school and you have, a very good chance of getting into these schools for college. So I was kind of on the architecture track-ish in high school, but I was really great at math. I finished all the AP classes and I was taking community college credits as a senior. And I had my portfolio ready to go. And sorry, I need to get rid of a notification. I had my portfolio ready to go. And sometimes the world, God, universe, whatever word you like to use, has other plans for you. And I got into a rear end. I was rear-ended. My portfolio was in the back of the SUV I was driving. The whole back window shattered. This is pre-digital anything, filled up with water and floated away any ability I'd been working on that portfolio for years, any ability to apply to art school. I never really thought of myself as an artist, but that's where architects went, right, to art school. So then I started looking more seriously at engineering programs, and Drexel had architectural engineering, which is structural and civil and all of those things on how to be an engineer for building construction essentially. And that's how I ended up there. I went to Drexel University in Philly, and then I worked for a big, top construction management firm for about 5 years before I moved out to Vegas. I continued to work for them for a few more, and then the 2008 crash hit. And I've pretty much been on the consulting side of things since then, which has worked out really great for me. And that's a little bit of like what I wanted to talk about in the myth of the work-life balance, especially in more technical male-dominated fields.
Oh, you took us back to 2008.
2008.
Yeah, everybody like, I was just a kid. Like, okay. So, some of us have lived through a few things.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate to have worked through the actual crash. Up to 2017, I made it through. And it's by his grace,
Yeah.
literally by his grace that I made it. And so architecture, now you're an engineer, you're doing consulting, things are looking the way they're looking. And so you realize that you, hold on 1 minute.
I think said that correctly, has joined us. Welcome.
I am going to
Good evening.
So just so you know, we are recording. So yeah, okay. So I'll just have somebody edit it out.
No worries.
So there you are. The OE crash happens and you're now on the consulting side. And I know there are many people right now that may watch, that may join us live, that have been laid off. And so when you're like, I'm on a consulting side, what does that mean? Because a lot of technical people aren't sure, like, what do you mean a consultant? I do design work.
I was working for a big CM firm. They had a major casino client here in Vegas, and I was part of a scheduled layoff. You know, they have so much money in budgets, and so my budget ran out. The project was getting, essentially any construction and engineering job, aside from a few, you're going to continue to work it's project based. You're going to continue to work yourself out of a job. So they laid me off. I took my severance. I let the client know that I had friends and everything there. And they asked, I came in for an interview a few weeks later, and then I was direct to them on 1099, which is essentially like the lowest rung of the consulting ladder. Like, they're paying you direct. You get a little bit of extra money for like taxes and your cell phone. And like, for the most part, your staff extension. And then from there, I had a variety of different construction and consulting agreements over the years. Sometimes I was direct. Sometimes I worked for somebody else who was a consultant and I was on their payroll. At one point I had a construction management firm. So I had a project under that, and I was on payroll for that for my company. So it's been a variety of things over the years, but it hasn't been like a traditional corporate CM or GC since the '08 crash. One thing I wanted to mention about the topic that we're talking about, the myth of work-life balance. When I got laid off at that point, there was the severance package that was, I forget how much it was, but it was like something like a week or 2 weeks per year you were at that company. And then we were allowed to bank all of our vacation. I'd worked for the company for just a little over 5 years, and I cashed out, separate from the severance, over 12 weeks of vacation, which meant that in those 5 years, I had taken nearly zero vacation. And so, there wasn't really a lot of balance there. I had a heavy focus on my career at that point. And, the myth of work-life balance and why I think it's not real is like, it's portrayed as like an engineer, right? Like, it's portrayed as a scale. I'm a structural engineer with one support, and you're just supposed to magically put the right amount of personal life and the right amount of work. And if you get it exact, then you'll feel okay, right? And you're not bobbling around all the time. But like any logical person, you don't have to be an engineer, knows that if something's supported by one thing, there's no support. It's perpetually unbalanced. Whereas like a three-legged stool, where you have like yourself, whatever word you want to use, your community, your spouse, your partner, your tribe, whatever, and then like society or the industry that you're in, right? Like, those three things can be put together we can build something, right? We can engineer something that has balance. And I think post pandemic and shutdown, a lot of things have changed. I know, Michelle, I've seen you say all over the internet that, we're not going back to 2019, so figure something else out, right? Like we're going to figure something else out. It might not look exactly like what we want it to look like, and it's not going to look exactly like what you want it to look like, but there's something else, because we're not going back to that. And we have the opportunity here to create careers, create companies, create cultures that have that ability to be balanced, right? Like it takes all three things, but it can work out. I know both of us also really have a lot of passion for fitness and movement. If you need another analogy, like it, a lot of the imagery and portraying of like finding that work-life balance, especially for those of us who've become mothers and are working moms and continuing in our careers. It's like this yoga, like find the serenity and balance on one foot. And it's really more like, in my experience so far, my son's about to be 5. It's like being a quarterback. Like people think of yoga instructors as having really good balance, but nobody's trying to knock them over, right? Like a quarterback, a really good quarterback has incredible balance because they're running, somebody's trying to knock them over. They don't have both feet on the ground ever, and they have a priority. So like that, like either you pick which image you want to go, but we're not doing the scale and we're not doing the yoga instructor, right? Like the balance that we're trying to figure out is a dynamic balance, and it's well thought out.
I love those examples. And I was over here as you were saying how much they cash you out at 12 weeks. You had me beat. The max we could accrue was 400 hours. So
well, they didn't limit our accruals because we didn't take vacation.
Yeah,
and it was a private company. It wasn't a publicly traded company, so they could do things like that.
Yeah, we were publicly traded, every single one. And it had been more than that. So it had, I think at one point it was either 480 or 600. I think it was 600 at one point in time, but I didn't have enough seniority to accrue 600 hours.
Yeah.
And so the check looks good. Like it's an extra backup plan if and when you get laid off. And that's the pro and the con about unlimited PTO.
Yeah. And the reason I had accrued that much, aside from I was very career focused, I was one of just a handful of women working, so you feel like you have that double standard. That was my maternity leave plan, because there was paid maternity leave at this company, which was unheard of. This full pay, 12 weeks. And then anything past that, you could take unpaid. They didn't have to guarantee your job because now you're outside of FMLA, but you could take unpaid and just sort of risk it. So I had banked 6 months thinking like, okay, well, I would like to have kids. It was 2008. I had just met my now husband. And that was something that I was already 28 at the time. I didn't end up having kids till almost 10 years later. But for a variety of reasons. But, that was part of my priorities. Was I was, trying to plan ahead the best I could, doing the things that the people before me had told me, was a good idea. And then none of it worked out that way, not even a little bit. The same way that, we've all lived through 2019 for better or worse, and we're not going back. 2008 was very much that way for the construction industry, and the people, for the most part, the people who were construction people stayed in construction, and the influx of people, who were there for the boom left. Every sector of the industry and geographic area is a little bit different, but overall, the construction people stayed, and everybody else went on to other things. And it was a huge shift in the industry from the way things were done up until then. From my experience and the clients that I was working with, I saw a lot more adoption of technology, because you just had less people, so you had to be more efficient. And that was in the field and in the office. I saw a lot more consulting opportunities. Companies didn't want to hold on to employees because consultants were, easier, they felt. The joke became, what's the difference between a consultant and an employee is whether they're mad at you at the end of the job or not. Because at the end of the job, everybody gets laid off and the consultants are like, okay, cool, call me next time. And the employees were, like, how dare you not keep me on when there's no more work? And that working through the low points and effectively ended in 2008. And so that's a lot of where I think, again, work-life balance happens in construction is, we redline it when there's work, and then, when there's not, and then this is a day-to-day and a week-to-week and a year-to-year sort of thing, right? Like there's days where I remember it being a slow week on the site and I was out at 2:00 every day for a week and it was amazing. And my friends who had more, traditional industry jobs where you got there at 8 and you left at 5, period, no matter how slow or busy or whatever was going on, or later, they were like, you're out at 2. And I was like, well, there wasn't really anything to do. They said we could leave, right? And at the time we were all salaried employees. So there is a little bit of that built into the industry where, there's golf days and there's, late lunches and 3-hour lunches and things like that.
I want to have you pause for a minute because you and I come out of the very similar experience in industry, where in the days on construction, I just want to frame this for some people understanding right now we're in daylight savings time. So we're at light. Let's say the crews can start at 7 and they can work to 7:30, 8 o'clock. And so when we say we can leave at 2, most times once daylight savings time starts until it ends, they're trying to work. A lot of those crews are trying to work 7 to 7 or 7 to 7:30. And our days, our weeks become long, the months run over. And you're like, when is daylight saving times over so I can get a life back? And so don't think that in this particular industry, you see a lot of 2 o'clock days. You see a 2 o'clock day if the weather's bad, like it's hailing, it's going to be an ice storm, wind is, like, those are usually the only
or
times.
Something went really wrong and they can't work. That was actually that week that I got to go home, and that was one time in years, right? But that week that I got to go home at 2 o'clock almost every day was because something was catastrophically wrong on the job site. So they were like, just get out of here. It's slow. There's nothing to do. So
as you go back and you picked up something I think we should hone in on, which is culturally we were taught certain things that our boomer parents, and I'm, a generation ahead of us, taught us how to behave in the workplace, how we should show up in the workplace.
Correct.
What are those things, one or two of them that you said probably are more detrimental to work-life balance not occurring for us?
I think the biggest one, and I'm right on the line between X and millennial. They make up new words for us all the time, but I'm the November 79, so I'm like literally on the line, and I relate to both. I relate to both a lot. Usually Gen X leading, but it depends. It depends on the situation. I think I bring that up because I think the millennials were the first to catch on of that. Corporations don't have the loyalty that they used to, like we talked about before 08. Their construction staff was retained between jobs, and you went back to the home office. And after 08, I didn't really see that at all unless they were at an executive level. I think my boomer parents taught me to be the most educated in the room, if at all possible, be the most prepared in the room, if at all possible. And that doing, it worked for them because it was probably true then, and I don't think it's true anymore, but that there was a direct relationship between how hard you worked and how much you were going to get paid and how much loyalty was at the end of that agreement. And I don't think that that's really around anymore. And it, depending on your opinion, is a good or bad thing. But yeah, that's how I was taught to show up in the workplace by my parents. They were both in the law and legal industry. So a lot of what I learned about how to show up in the workplace in construction, I learned from some very early mentors that really they just liked me. They liked me. They liked that I worked hard. They liked that I never said no. And when I graduated college in 2003, there had been and continued to be for a few more years a huge lack of talent in the construction and engineering industry because IT and tech had just sucked it all out. So they didn't have a lot of people, they weren't hiring 10 new people a year anywhere in any of these firms, right? It was a handful here and there. People would work for a few years and be like, this is not what I thought it would be. And they would go back for a master's, or they'd use their degree to get into some other sector. And so I got a lot of really early on mentoring for, essentially just being there and being hardworking and good. And I learned a lot of how to maneuver in the construction world from my first two or three mentors that I had.
Did they also bring in any of the other things that may have made your experience in corporate unbalanced?
Oh yeah, they were, because they were redlining their lives too, right? So they were the example. I would say out of that first big construction job, it was a transit job I was on. I was a tiered sub for a major construction household, not household name, but everybody would know. And a lot of them were alcoholics. A lot of them were in divorce, about to be divorced, just finished a divorce. There was a lot of really not great stuff happening in their lives, but they were successful in that. They were successful in their career. And so they continued to focus on being successful in their careers, the only thing that's important, and then just kind of burn down everything else. And just to be clear, all of my mentors to date have been in construction, have been male. I haven't worked, I worked for one woman, but she was so many rungs up the ladder, it wasn't like a very close relationship.
Is interesting. Well, not interesting. It does track to what they taught you. And again, because of that work-life unbalance, remember, seeing alcoholism, seeing the number of divorces. And I met people when I was in the industry that were on what I thought was a good marriage. And I'm talking to people this year like, oh no, such and such got divorced. Yeah, my wife left me. The second one left.
It won't talk to them, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, like, yeah. And even these were people I worked directly with. We had the same employer. And then there were other people that would be on the job site with me because I travel. So when I say I would get on a plane and I'd fly home for 5 days a month. And so imagine you being married, right? And you're telling your spouse and your kids or whomever, you'll see them next month for 5 days and not even 5 full days.
And there's a lot of opportunities that I've turned down over the years because, so perfect segue into another thing I wanted to talk about, which was part of the balance myth is, you know, it's portrayed as a scheduling problem, right? Like, I had this decade-long obsession, and there's a lot of women in other industries and other parts of the world that are like, we have this planner obsession because we think if we could just get the right schedule, if we can get the right book that writes down our task lists and all the things that like are like, we're gonna have this sigh of like relief because life is going to be good. And I spent some time doing construction scheduling, and so I have a very intimate knowledge of like how to schedule thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of very minute details into a bigger vision, right? And so somewhere along the lines, I told myself that, or I don't know, was mothering myself or something. I was like, Marisol, in the mirror, you don't have a scheduling problem. You have a priority problem. Once your priorities are clear and in line, that's exactly how you do a CPM schedule. And for those of you who are not in industries that use that, it's called a critical path method schedule. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means. But like, once that's exactly how you do a critical path, is you set what the priorities are. They have things called milestones, just like your life. You know, we as society have some milestones that may or may not be important to us as a whole, like, you know, finishing college, getting married, those life milestones that you want to, you know, you may or may not want to check off your list. But once you put those in priority, it becomes very easy to schedule in a critical path method. So what the easiest way to explain critical path, and I can't remember how I came up with this idea, but somewhere along the lines, I decided that I could apply that to my life. And that was part of like being able to achieve this mythical balance, was these are my priorities. And then critical path means that you take all the activities that you have to get done for this big end goal, finish the building or the project, and you figure out what has to happen before something else what has to be complete before something else can start. And then the critical part comes in, is when is the last day that can be done, right? So to use an example like in your life, like motherhood versus going to college, right? There is not as early as I would like us to have believe, but if being a mother is important to your life path, there's a date that needs to be accomplished by, right? Like the closer you get to that date, the less likely it is that you'll be able to have a child, right? There are other methods and all of that, but versus something like going to college and getting an advanced degree, maybe you want to go back for a PhD, maybe you want to go back for a master's, maybe you never got an undergrad. There's no time on that, right? Like, as long as you're still here, you can still go do it, right? So when you put things in priority of what's important to you, and then you take into account the critical path, right? What do I have to get done before this, before that, before this? It really takes a lot of pressure off of the things. And so I mentioned my husband before. He has his own business. He's specialty millwork. So they do stores, convention booths, builds all kinds of really cool custom stuff. And it's an industry here in Vegas where a lot of the times they have to do installations overnight. It's his company. He has, he's been growing it since I met him. I think he opened it about 6 months before we met. And so being able to know what my priorities were for myself, and him being able to know what his priorities were, and then my son's almost 5 now, talking about and being on the same page about where our son fits into our priorities. And that took so much. I mean, it's still stressful. Like, I'm not going to say that us having, you know, being in consulting and having a 5-year-old, and I'm 43, like I'm not a young mom, and him having a business and he travels, and sometimes even if he's local, he works overnight, and I'm a consultant. So I never know like what's happening with, with that, every changes all the time. Like it's still chaos, but we maintain a good place in our relationship because we talk about those things. So right now, and it was reversed when we first met, he's making significantly more money than I am. So him being at work for things that only he can do because he has employees is priority one, right? And then me being at work because there isn't anybody else, like I'm a party of one, right, is priority two. And then my son's needs. And then after that, and I think that's where, I read a lot of mom blogs, but it really applies to everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a parent or not. One of the big things when we talk about work-life balance and like how to do it all is that they make that list. So what I was saying was that, a lot of what I see online and blogs and news articles and, everybody's always, there's always a panel at events that you go to. They talk about, okay, well, set your priorities. But what I've never heard, and is a conversation that my husband and I have a lot, is what's a want and what's a need. So like my son needs to eat every day, right? Like my son needs shelter. My son needs to go to school. We want him to do well in school. We want him to have, access to great education. We need vehicles. We might want a nicer vehicle, right? So like, I think when people say like, oh, okay, well, I put my kids' needs first, awesome. But are you also lumping in a whole bunch of things that your kids want and they don't necessarily need, right? At the expense of your needs and at the expense of your wants. And I think that, I am not at all a relationship expert, but I think, just seeing from the outside, a lot of relationships in industries like construction and engineering, they don't have that designation. It's like, okay, well, this is the priority, and it's all treated the same, whether it's, college tuition or concert tickets that they want, right? Like there's a different level of what that priority should be. And so, we try and be very clear about, is this something I want or is this something I need? And kind of lump our way through it. And it doesn't always look like, it's not super structured. We're not like writing this out on a dry erase board and planning our lives that way, but we keep an open dialogue, and whenever something happens, which is like almost a weekly occurrence, and the schedule has to change or somebody has to do something, somebody has to do something different, I have to pick my son up, or I have to work an extra day, or I can't do something, we have a conversation about like, okay, well, why can't you do it? Or what do you need to do? That's the first thing my husband asks you. I'll say like, I need you to pick him up. And he's like, well, what is it that you need to do? I was like, all right, well, pump the brakes. This is what I'm doing, right? And it's like, I'm not just chilling in my car eating Cheetos with that hour and a half that I'm gonna, and you know what? If that's what I need to do, because I'm gonna lose my mind, I tell him that. I'll be like, listen, if I have to pick him up, I had a really hard day, and if I have to pick him up right now, it's gonna be bad for everybody. I need a minute to calm, TF down. And, he'll say like, oh, well, I have to meet a client, or the truck is late, or we didn't get our inventory, whatever the thing is. And we decide in that moment, whose need gets priority at that point. So I don't know. I think that in the professional and diversity and, women, like women's in engineering and construction and all of those spaces, the conversation continues to be that if you just put in enough effort, somehow you can fix it. Yeah. And if you can't be one person in a broken system and fix it. You can't be one couple, right? Back to our three-legged stool analogy. You can't be you and your partner and your boss and your company, your family, and then the whole, the laws. And before we started the recording, we were talking about the Pregnant Workers Act is rolling out soon. The laws in the state that you're in, the things that are acceptable in the industry that you're in. That's that third part of your three-legged stool. There's no amount of me and my husband working it out between us that's going to fix what's, not working in greater sense, right? So
I want to dig into, you talked about how we individually with our tribes or our community need to be able to figure out our critical path. How do you recommend women in the workplace do the same thing? Like, what does that look like? Hey, I need you to, when your boss comes to you, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. I have my approach, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how do they then figure out how to get balance in the workplace as things are being assigned to them or being added to their plate per se. What are some things you can do?
So I went back to work full-time on a construction site while breastfeeding, while pumping, at a more senior level than I'd ever been at when my son was 9 months old. And there was no balance. There was no mental health. I had postpartum anxiety. I didn't know that was a thing. And the only thing I was able to do in that scenario was I had somebody there who was an advocate for me. I made it very clear when I got there that I had a hard stop at 5 p.m., which in construction is late-ish, right? Like, depending on, like, that project started in the office. Usually most people were in there by 7. I was usually in there by 8, depending on how the morning went. And I told them I had a hard stop at 5 because daycare closes at 5:30. And that was it. And so I communicated it early on. I said, I can't take this job. And, they're not going to say, oh, well, don't come, right? Like, they probably can't even legally say that. But I communicated very early on and reiterated and proactively, 3 o'clock, I would check in with people that may or may not need me, because the MO for execs in the section of the industry I was in, and I don't know if different sectors are different, is that they're slammed with meetings all day long. They slow down around 3:30, 4 o'clock. They sit down at their desk at 4 o'clock, emails, everything is on fire. And then at 4 p.m., they effectively start their second half of their workday.
Yep.
And that's when they need answers, and that's when it's immediate, and that's when everything, and you've sent them the information 2 days ago, you followed up with them that morning, you've whatever. So I would have like a drop dead reminder to the people that I knew were coming for me at 4:55 that, I'm leaving in 2 hours. Is there anything you need from me before I leave?
Yep.
And you shouldn't have to do that, but that was one of the things where it was like, right, critical path. Like, if I don't tell you by 3, I'm not getting out of here by 5. And if I'm not out of here by 5, now it's $12 per 15 minutes, which is such a random number to me. I don't know why that still sticks. $12 per 15 minutes that I'm late to go pick up this baby, right? Not to mention that I'm still breastfeeding and they're like ticking time bombs just waiting to explode all over my shirt. But what What else are you gonna do?
No, I love that you had boundaries. You shared with them the boundaries. You built structure in a space, in a place that can literally go haywire with one person not paying attention to a backup horn, right?
Yeah.
Or somebody not checking before they back up a piece of equipment.
Yeah. And I don't know that I would have been able to do any of those things if I was in that same situation in my career at 22.
Yeah,
If I got married right out of school and had a kid right out of school and went back to work, I took 9 months off on purpose because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to, function at, I mean, I was barely functioning on the job site at 9 months. So 6 weeks was a pipe dream for me.
I know that is
Even 12 or 6 months, it wasn't going to be a possibility for me. So I had that ability because I had skill set that they needed. And I don't know if that would have been true for me at 22 when I was a field engineer and I was just writing shit in a daily log, right? And they could have gotten anybody else with a 4-year degree to do it. It didn't even have to be in engineering.
That is true. I like the thing I would say, one of the things I did early on was sort of like you. I set boundaries, but I also built relationships. And so when Michelle said what she said, I'm only going to repeat it one more time because the assumption is you were doing something when I said it the first time. And so the second time I said, I'm sending an email. That way you can refer to it. And people are like, what do you mean? And so the example I always get, like, oh, how did you get a proof of vacation? I'm like, I don't get a proof of vacation. I let people know when I won't be there. And people are like, wait, how does that work? I said I would send them when I would be out. And because I wasn't out enough, not what I meant was, especially early on, I didn't take off enough time, what that looked like. Now, when I talked about earlier, I had all this PTO stacked up.
Yeah.
We flew home once a month. What I left out was how I worked the system so that when I flew home, I was generally not burning PTO. I only burn PTO twice a year. Well, more than, but generally the week of Thanksgiving. And then for Christmas to New Year. And trust me, the first holiday I ever burned, beginning of the year, was a floating holiday because I wanted, like, I'm not using PTO, I'm using a floating holiday. Then I would fly back on company time. And so understanding too, what does it look like in your organization as far as benefits and what they have available for you to find that balance. And so I was able to work, I call it the gray. It was like everything's black and white. I worked in the gray. I mixed that black and white together, or maybe that's brown. I worked in the gray. and in that, it's like, what are your needs as an individual? That until they tell you no, you can't do it anyway. Right. And you have to push those boundaries, those limits. Often for women, we're looking for permission. I got out of the point where if I needed something from Michelle, I wasn't asking you for permission. It wasn't about to happen. The last thing I want to add is too, like, you went to people and said, hey, what do you need? They had to make a decision. And I used to have the sign up on my desk. They had 3 options. They could only pick 2 or 3 options. They could get it fast, they could get it cheap, or they could get it good. And I would point to my first manager when I worked. I said, what was his name? I can't remember right now. I like, pick 2 of the 3. He's like, what do you mean? I said, pick 2 of the 3. I said, well, matter of fact, you're not paying me enough, so you got cheap. So you want it good or you want it fast? Let me know. He's like, I need it good. I said, all right, see you tomorrow. And I would get up and leave at 3:30 because we were the job for a permit. That's no other story. But sometimes,
I know those ones.
Like setting limits and pushing it back on them to make a decision. They're like, well, you did this. Like, that wasn't my decision. I simply asked you. Yeah. You set the boundaries and to follow those.
You reminded me of something that I think you and I have talked about offline before, is that in construction, construction, women who are, Indigenous, Latina, brown, Black, all of those things, we in larger society get pegged as like a problem or loud or feisty, like all these words, right? But in construction and engineering, a lot of those characteristics are what gets promoted. And when men do it, they get promoted. And often when we do it, it's acceptable. And so I did have a few experiences over the years. I've been doing this 22 years now. More. It's 2023. I've been doing this 23 years. Of women saying like, oh, well, you can get away with saying I leave at 3:30. You can get away with saying blah, 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 because they had a perception of themselves about how they needed to show up. And it was different than what I thought I could do. And I would have to say a lot of my questionable behavior was rewarded in construction. Using foul language at work was funny to people. Being mean to people that I didn't get what I wanted out of was acceptable. There was a lot of stuff that, would have been a problem somewhere else. And in construction, it was viewed as, being tough, being no bullshit, being good at my job. And had I been doing it in the exact same thing in another industry, it would not have been.
I agree. I wasn't laughing at what you were saying. I was laughing because I'm having a flashback when I worked on a project.
Because you did it too.
I did. I was laughing because when I was on a project in Pittsburgh, it's the first construction job I did, one of the client reps would fly in from Houston. And I would go over to his office. He had an office. I was in the cube, of course. Don't worry about it. Don't feel bad for me. We were working out of a storage shed. So when the snow melted, it melted into our shed. And we had poison ivy in the summer growing through crack. So don't feel like he got to upgrade because he had an office. He's from Texas and it was Pennsylvania in the wintertime. He had a window office. Just so snow. But anyway, I remember I would go to his office like, he's like, I'm like, you got, he's like, I'm working on your report right now. You're so mean. I was like, Oscar, how am I mean? I'm like, you gonna want this information. I can't give you what he's like, I know, just can you work overtime? And it would just be that the relationship that I gained with him because he liked my, and I remember specifically, we were having an internal meeting with us, those of us that worked in construction site, my employer at the time, and the client's reps. And Oscar sends me, I was a cost engineer, so he sends me the invoice that he just slides it down the table. I look at it, he said, yeah, you screwed that up. And I look at the day that it was signed or whatever was my birthday. I slid it back to him and said, I didn't screw that up. I said, I wasn't even here. That's my birthday. I don't work on my birthday. And he goes, who does this, right? Who does this at 29 or whatever? He slides it back. He's like, well, can you fix it? Just bill overtime to it.
See?
So we have some leeway sometimes in the field specifically. In the office is something different.
My view is that whatever slight, minute advantage that I may possess, I'm going to use it to its full capacity till it stops working.
Absolutely.
So, there are so many other things that may not be fair. I try not to bun up about that, but the things that I can use, I'm going to use them 100%. I'm going to use them 110%.
Yeah, I taught a lot of people how to work around the employee handbook. I say it says right here this phrase. It said, yeah, that means this. I said, who told you that? Because according to Merriam-Webster, it could mean this, this, and this. Look at me. I said, so which one of those meanings do you like? And they would select that one. I said, perfect. That's how you do your home leave based on that definition. I said, have a good trip with you and the family at Disney. And I walk away. They go off on their trip to like whatever. They were like, nobody said anything. I said, what are they going to say? Per our definition, we created that. It falls, it was an employee handbook, and people were really weirded out. Like, we worked in the 4% of the contract.
Yeah.
And that was, so it's really important to understand some people's
If
boundaries.
they, run these contracts for every inch of their life in other, in schedule, in budget, in whatever other, in payment terms, right? Like, contracts are in agreement until you have to, you have to see if it ends up in court or not.
Yep.
And you can see what's enforceable. So if they're going to do that with other parts of contracts, then the contract shouldn't be any different.
Absolutely.
And that's if you even have an employment contract versus like Nevada's employment at will.
Yeah, I every state I've worked in so many, I don't know what they were. I know Texas, what Texas was, I can tell you that much. But as we wrap up, what final thoughts or things, actions would you like the listener to take?
So I did tips. They're pretty basic, but they are really important. The first one took me a very long time to learn, which is a little bit embarrassing, but we touched on this earlier about like, the mentors I had were just redlining their whole lives, right? Is to look for other people that you would want to trade lives with, right? Like somebody who has, and whether, in construction, it might be hard to find that person, right? But somewhere, find somebody who's got it figured out in a way that you would like to get to, and build a relationship with that person, or stalk them online, or whatever it is that you can do to try and mirror as much of that, because that's just the way human nature is. And a lot of why having people that went before you is important is if you can visualize it, there's so much, like it's in everything, there's so much better chance that you can actually do it. Your brain doesn't actually know it's not real yet. The second one, and I grew up on the East Coast, so this was like breathing air, is comparison. Like from kindergarten, we were taught how to be, we had class rankings in like grade school, who was in the top percent, who was on the honor roll, who wasn't on the honor roll, who was on like there was some like secondary national something honor roll that was even better than the regular, like constant comparison. And guess what? Like, unless you're uber elite, that there's probably 30% of the people out there better than you, right? Like there's a ton of people out there better than you, but it doesn't matter because they're not living your life. So the more you compare yourself to what everybody else is doing, what they're, within reason, right? Like you don't want to get underpaid, but what they're making, what their benefits are, what their family looks like, if they're married or they're not married, or all of those things, like know what you want and live your life, stop comparing. And that was something that I really feel like it was like learning to breathe underwater and to not compare. Especially my mom's side of the family is Indian, and India and China and all of that culture is very academic focused, in very much in a comparison manner. And then my last one is use your tools, especially all these cool, fun AI tools that are rolling out, tools that, your employee handbook is a tool, positive hire is a tool, that WhatsApp or Instagram group thread or iMessage thread with all your girls in it, that's a tool. If you're living your life without a message thread of like a solid group of people, like hit me up or something, because you need that in your life. You have to have people that you can just text and be like, you will not believe what this person just said, or what just happened, or I'm going to lose my mind, or this happened, what do I do, right? Like you need that. Those are your tools. And then one of my favorites right now at the moment is an app called Structure, or Structured. It's pink. It has a little checkbox, and it's a calendar app. And what I love about it versus everything else that's out there is that it has audio AI. So a busy mom doing too many things, I can hit the button while I'm driving or when I get in bed or literally while I'm in the shower and say, okay, today I need to, and just say all of it. And it'll put it into tasks and timelines. And I'll say, I need to be done by noon. And then at 3, whatever. And it's it all in there. And it has integrations and things like that. But it's really cool because it's timeline focused. It's not like a classic Google Calendar where you're like blocking things out. And so you can very easily. And one of the disciplines on is planning out my day. It does not plan, and then whatever I can't do with, I bring back to deal with, because like we talked about in our life, right? Like trying to find that balance and not letting things fall through the cracks that are important, that are priorities, that are, you know, things that need to get done. Having some sort of structure, whether it's on paper, whether it's an app, whatever your tool is to get things done, to make sure you don't forget I love it when I've outsmarted myself on something. So like very mundane tasks, like I have bad allergies, and so changing the air filters in my house is a non-negotiable. Otherwise my whole face swells up and I start to get that post-nasal drip, which will really quickly turn into bronchitis. So like it's there as a task, ready to go every 6 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever. And when it comes up, I'm so excited. I'm like, I remembered to tell future me to do it. It's one less thing I have to stress out about. So yeah, use your tools, whatever that looks like for you, to make your life easier, because automation is here. And if you can do something once, you shouldn't have to ever do it again. Like you should be able to find somewhere to continue doing it over and over.
I love it. I love it. Do it that way. You only call your kids' name one time. Imagine if you could only call their names one time. And you actually call us by the right name. My mom's in the other room, so 5 kids. And she's like, you know which one I meant. It's like, okay. So Marisol, thank you so much for this today. I liked your take on this and how to restructure and for us to find our own balance in our careers, in the workplace, and at home. So we have that 3-legged stool. And yes, we do have those text threads or DMs. It goes to DMs in many different ways. So I absolutely love that. So
the positive hire Facebook group. If you don't have a DM group going, then reach out to Michelle for the positive hire Facebook group, because that's a good time too.
But thank you so much for this.